My brothers and sisters, our good news is that which has been recorded by Mark. Then they came to Capernaum, and on the Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue, and he taught. The people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. In their synagogue was a man with an unclean spirit. The spirit cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Jesus rebuked him and said, "Quiet, come out of him." The unclean spirit convulsed him, and with a loud cry came out. All were amazed and asked one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." His fame spread everywhere throughout the whole region of Galilee. The gospel of Christ. Praise be to you, O Christ. Please be seated. So good morning, everyone, on this rather soggy morning. So why don't we talk a little bit about what the synagogue looks like, and then also pull in a little bit about what Paul is talking about here, so that you could maybe get a sense of, in the Protestant Reformation, why there are no statues within a Protestant church. During the time of Martin Luther, even before Martin Luther, with this individual called Hess, who was in Prague at the time, Budapest, I believe, there was this thinking that, we had to get back to basics. And the issue at the time was the Roman Catholic Church and the fact that they were selling, relics. They were selling bones, and they were selling pieces of the cross of Jesus Christ. There is this joke that if you put all the pieces of the cross of Jesus Christ together, that it equals the Empire State Building right now, okay? Because there was just so much of that going on, and they were selling indulgences, and it was all about worshiping saints, and Martin Luther and others during his time felt that they were getting way off track. And so if you look at a Protestant church, and I would imagine to say that, I'm not sure if we're Protestant, we're probably non-traditional in our basic core, but if you look at us, we're basically clear of everything except for the Word and, of course, the cross. In the synagogue that Jesus would have walked into, there would have been a very similar setting just like this one. It would have not had a lot of paintings or pictures, no depictions at all. There simply would have been the Torah or the writings at the centerpiece of the gathering. There would have been a seat where the one who is teaching sits, and then ultimately the people would come and gather like this. There was a simplicity of how it was structured. It is interesting that the way we use candles to signify, say the presence of the Word, in the very same way in those days there would have been a candle to signify the Torah or any writings that were in the center of the synagogue. But this is basically a very bare space. And Jesus would have been very comfortable going in and out of synagogues. Every Jewish child is taught, every Jewish male child, not females, sorry, have nothing to do with it. It was cultural. But every male child was taught, the scriptures. And so Jesus and others, males, would have been in and out of a synagogue all the time for their regular daily teachings. This would have happened consistently. The fact that Jesus ends up in Capernaum, which is a different place than where he grew up, and that he walks into the synagogue and actually begins teaching is rather dramatic. And I know we hear this all the time, so we're not really sensitized anymore. We're probably very desensitized to the fact that Jesus runs around and teaches. But realize, if you will, Jesus is not an ordained rabbi. He's not been trained in any rabbinic tradition. The only training that he traditionally has is that of every other Jewish male in his time and in his culture. And so Jesus would not have been seen worthy or trained or prepared or properly, whatever, to be teaching, to a crowd. And yet he draws all these people to himself and simply is teaching inside a synagogue, just teaching. And the people gather, and apparently there are also scribes and Pharisees there. Now, scribes, their job was basically to write down the Torah and other writings of the prophets, onto documents. And in case you didn't know, in order to write the 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, the Torah, for our Jewish brothers and sisters, it takes about a year. It takes a year of nonstop, endless writing just to do that one document by hand. And that one document, and I know because we ended up purchasing one, and I have it in our house, is just, it's just endless. It's just voluminous. So these people who are scribes, they're not to be passed over as though they don't have any value or authority. They do. They actually understand and know the scriptures because they're the ones writing the scriptures down. Now, mind you also, there's not a lot of writing taking place at the time because there's not a lot of paper, and paper is very expensive. And so you got to recognize that as much as they are rabbis, they are trained in how to do this, but it doesn't mean they're functioning fully because paper is very expensive, and so not too many people are asking for Torahs as we do today. We just go to a bookstore and pick something up. My point to all this is that there is a society, there is a culture in place. There is a culture that you and I have to sort of place ourselves in to realize that Jesus steps in the middle of all of that, and despite all the cultural and societal norms that are around him that should be limiting him, he is not limited. He does not feel limited. He is amazingly confident. I am very taken by the football games that we are experiencing now, the playoffs. And just for the record, anyone who wants me to pray for your team, please send a donation to 115. No, I'm kidding. But these games today, are going to be pretty major. But I am amazingly impressed. I really am. I am taken back by the fact that a 23, 25-year-old kid, okay, I'm old, 23, 25-year-old kid could step into a stadium with an enormous crowd, half of them loving you, the other half hoping that you have something traumatic happen to you that you can't throw the ball anymore, and yet command a team to try to move anywhere on a field. I am amazed at the amount of confidence that takes to do that. Because you are stepping into a situation that is critical, not to mention your personal, listen, I'm sure there's a place, in Portugal that they could move that no one would ever see them ever again. But generally speaking, everyone knows who you are. You're representing a team represents a city represents a state. There is an awful lot riding on the fact that you are doing what you do. I am amazed at the confidence that is required to get up and to do something like that. I think that type of confidence is what you have to apply to Jesus here, because it is not common. As much as there are itinerant preachers who are running around preaching, they're not walking into synagogues and preaching to people inside a synagogue. They're not. They're on the streets, they're on the byways, they're in the middle of fields. But Jesus actually goes into the synagogue to make this all happen. Now realize inside the synagogue is their Torah, the written word. The written word is God's presence. Jesus is walking into the most holiest place of the Jewish community, and he is standing in the middle, and he is preaching, and he is teaching from that spot. And every single person who has heard this, or has heard that he is coming, or that he is there, and also that the scribes and the Pharisees don't have Jesus thrown out, says something about Jesus's personality, his character. I really am looking forward to meeting him face to face, because I really do believe there is something about his presence, his countenance. And I'm not saying that from a spiritual high realm perspective. Remember, Jesus is as much human as he is divine. But there must have been something about him as a person that set everyone else at ease or relaxed them or settled them down. But here in this case, Jesus steps in and he is teaching with authority in the place where this community gathers to worship and to recognize the presence of God in their lives. Look around. That's exactly what we do here every Sunday. We gather as a community, and you're gathered because in this moment, in this time, we're hoping to reaffirm what it is that we believe, but we're also hoping to be strengthened for the week to come. And so we gather in this sacred place, and we gather as a community because our presence supports one another in knowing that I'm not the only crazy person who believes this, and that there's a possibility, there's a real distinct viability that God is real, and I'm not the only one who believes in this person of Jesus. This sacred space that Jesus walks in is the same, and yet Jesus is teaching with an authority that the scribes and others are not, and everyone is sitting back and going, wow, isn't that something? Let's get to the miracle. Let's get to the fact of the person with the unclean spirit, the man with the unclean spirit. We hear this all the time. We hear this story all the time. We don't even think about it. Can someone please explain to me why an unclean spirit would want their host to take them to a sacred place like a synagogue? It's a real question. If the man has an unclean spirit, and the unclean spirit is in control of parts of his life, why does this unclean spirit allow the host to enter into this holy place? What is it about that the unclean spirit cannot control? So the unclean spirit has an awful lot to say once he's already there. But yet at the same time, we have to admit, the host, the man, drags the spirit into the presence of Jesus. It has to be the man's will that is doing that. It's not the unclean spirit. The unclean spirit doesn't want to have a one-on-one with God, and he knows who he is. He's dragged in front of him, and he ends up crying out immediately, look, we already know who you are. What are you doing here, and what is your intention? Are you here to destroy us, right? I mean, he's basically crying out and asking that. But he's only doing that because he's been dragged into the presence in the first place. And what dragged him into the presence? It wasn't the unclean spirit. The unclean spirit doesn't want to have an encounter with God. And yet at the same time, this is the story that lays out for us, and we have to ask ourselves, what is it? And I think the truth of the matter is that this person, this man, is like all of us. It is simply an embodiment that Mark in his gospel is trying to make clear to all of us. We're all broken. We're all frail. We are all unclean and unworthy and undeserving of God's love and compassion and mercy. We are. And there is a section inside of us, there is a part inside of us, let's call it the soul. There's a part somewhere down deep inside of us that no matter how far we feel we have wandered away, no matter how much we feel we are distanced from God, that soul contains this little piece of hope that knows that if it can drag itself into the presence of God, God will do the rest. If it could get there with an openness and drag it there, that the presence of Jesus is enough to transform and transcend the present experience that he is having. And so I think for all of us, we feel the same way. Look, getting up this morning, looking at the rain outside, let's be honest. Did I want to make a 45-minute ride over here to have services when my wife could have made me eggs and bacon? I mean, come on. you know? But there is a part of you that ends up moving yourself, and you do things and you put yourself into the position where you're in the presence of Jesus. That's what the purpose of the story is. We're all this man. Okay, we don't have demons crying out of us, but we have to admit that there is an awful, terrible fight that takes place inside ourselves to choose the good over other things we would rather do. And I'm not saying the word evil because it's not always evil. It's just another choice. It's something else we could choose to do. But ultimately, a friend is in the hospital. Oh, God. I got to get to the parking lot. I have to park in the hospital. I have to wait in line. They have to take my ID. Then they give me a pass. Then I got to find my way to the hospital room. Then you end up going into the hospital room. It's very depressing. You're there in the midst of all that. You're there with the family. Stop me if any of this isn't true. I feel the same way. But why do you do those things? It's because it is the better nature of who and what we are. It is what Jesus would have wanted us to do. And more than that, if Jesus is the embodiment of what it means to be fully human, then his experiences, his example is something that we're meant to follow. And so in these situations, we drag ourselves out of our complacency into the presence of goodness. And that presence, in this case, had this man's spirit dismissed from him. I have preached about this ad nauseum, and the minute I start to say it, you're going to go, yeah, there he goes again. No one has ever entered the presence of Jesus and has left the same way they entered his presence. Read the Gospels. Every encounter. Oh, and by the way, just to sort of wrap this all up, the man with the unclean spirit didn't ask for the unclean spirit to be taken away. He didn't ask for anything. He simply got there. He didn't say anything. He didn't line up and say to Jesus, look, I'm a mess. I got this going on. I have that going on. Would you help me? Would you heal me? Would you change me? Would you please get this out so I could live a more perfect life? Can you show me hope? Can you show me wisdom? Can you show me love? Can you show me unconditional love so I believe in myself so I could live my life to the fullest? He doesn't say anything. Doesn't say a word. And yet in the midst of the encounter, Jesus already acts. He already acts. And see, that's where I don't understand where we get the vision over and over again. I spend most of my time as a preacher trying to correct some of the things that we have been taught or we believe. That somehow we have to beg God to do something good for us. As if God's not already fully functioning in our life. Our prayer isn't for God to intercede, that somehow we're going to nudge God's will to do something that God doesn't want to already do. We pray for ourselves so that we believe and we remember that our lives are not ourselves and that our lives are a gift. Oh, and by the way, in this thing we call human existence, there is the presence of that which is sacred and divine. Prayer is for us. Prayer is not for God. And yet here's the exact same case. When the demon cries out and says, what do you want with us? Or what are you going to do? Are you going to destroy us and all, right? Jesus just immediately, he doesn't have to be asked. He doesn't have to be begged or coerced. No family member comes up and goes, oh, he's been like this all the time. Can you do something? No one says anything. Jesus simply says, quiet, come out. And it's done. But realize that we have to get into the presence of Jesus first. And that is the one thing I believe over and over and over again. If there is one responsibility a preacher has, it's not about church structures. It's not about institutions. It's not about donations. It's about trying to get us all to realize that this Jesus is resurrected from the dead. His spirit is present, and it is our job to try to bolster every bit of our human free will and drag ourselves into the presence of Jesus, simply because as we do that time and time again, Jesus' presence, his words transform our present situation. And if not, we never leave without hope or confidence or trust that there is someone greater than us involved in all of this. So it is an interesting story, to say the least, because it's a common situation. The man ends up in the presence of Jesus, and Jesus acts. The man brings himself into the presence of Jesus, and Jesus acts. Simple faith, simple doctrine, simple example of what you and I simply have to do. We gather here, we do this on a Sunday as a community, but every single day we can find ourselves dragging ourselves into the presence of Jesus and simply trusting that Jesus already knows what we need and Jesus will act on our behalf. God bless you.